Loss of control in flight is one of the top accident causes in general aviation flying. I just recently posted my top 5 reasons for bonanzas and barons, top 5 reasons to crash, and loss of control in flight was in the top 3 for all of them. Most of the time, if you lose control in flight, you don't survive. Stick with me on Flywire as we take a look at the crash of 6129 Victor, a C33 Bonanza. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on Flywire, we're going to take a look at the crash of 6129 Victor near Hilltown, Pennsylvania on 24 February 2022. 2 men died in this crash, and there's enough on the record available that we can piece together what likely happened. I think so. And I think that it is important in an accident like this to see if the crew's conduct of the flight was a factor, and that might impact the way we fly. Awareness keeps people alive, and that's my main goal. Try to figure out what works and what doesn't. The airplane was based at Wings Field on the northern side of Philadelphia, which happens to be under Philly's Class B. The ADS-B record has a good amount of flying in February, including a few flights to the north and to the west of Wings Field that show a lot of maneuvering. The pilot owner was killed in this crash along with a longtime CFI from the area, and reportedly they were practicing the skills and maneuvers for a planned commercial check ride. At least that's the report. The record in February shows what looked to be 4 training flights on February 6th, 9th, and the 20th, as well as the 24th. The ADS-B track there shows similar profile to the accident flight on those 3 previous days. The weather on all 3 of those days was severe clear, if not a tad cold for a southerner like me. If you have watched more than a few of my videos, you'll know that I advocate for training, both the recurrent kind and trying something new and out of your ordinary experience. I applaud the pilot owner for trying something new and working on his commercial. It's not an easy check ride, it really isn't. There's lots of maneuvering and ground reference flying, and in a Bonanza, it's not a great commercial check platform. On the day of the accident, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. The weather was 3,800 overcast at the nearest airport, which was Pin Ridge, or Charlie Kilo Zulu. Visibility was 10 miles under the clouds. The weather at Hilltown showed the local winds to be about 8.5 knots from a 0.65. This overcast forced the flight into a lower training profile than they had been working with in the earlier training flights. They had been 5,000 or 6,000 feet in that range on the previous flights for some of their maneuvers. Let's take a look at the flight path for the accident flight. In this portion of the video, the accident pilot had climbed very near the cloud bases, or even perhaps in them. 3,800 is the report. The airplane topped at 3,900 feet before beginning a spiral maneuver. Given the descent rate, it looks like an engine-out practice with pretty good speed control down to about 900 feet AGL. And then the aircraft flew a wide climbing turn from the southwest to the northeast, pressed on the south and then back to the northeast, reaching about 2,700 feet. At that point, the airplane began a slow descent at a slow speed, eventually reaching a speed of 57 knots indicated during the descent. Can add ground speed with winds. It appears to be a slow flight event, a training event. Still in the slow flight profile, the airplane made an S-turn to the right and then back to the northeast, and then what appears to be a steady descent profile at about 62 knots indicated, approximately. About 2,300 feet, the airplane began a right turn, seemingly to line up with the runway at the private airstrip of Gundin Airport. Bottoming out at about 1,800 feet, 29 Victor began a 500 foot per minute climb at approximately 70 knots. Reaching 2,250 feet, the airplane was at 62 knots, tracking 032. Slowing slightly and turning through 028, the airplane was still climbing at 448 feet per minute, going through 2,275 feet. 2 seconds after that, the airplane was starting down, descending at 1,984 feet per minute, tracking through 010 degrees at 60 knots. Security camera footage did catch the last few seconds of the flight. This was too low for the ADS-B system to capture. An interesting thing was the prop hub broke on impact, and one of the blades went flying through the wall of an unoccupied bedroom not far from the crash. This the impact point. This is consistent with a near vertical impact on a hard surface and the engine turning at a relatively high rate of speed. Probably not full power, but fairly high. Given the door camera video, I think we can confirm that was what happened. I suspect that the power was never reduced throughout the event. From this ring camera, we can see a little more of the airplane and actually hear what transpired right before the impact. The first thing you hear is the prop noise from 29 Victor, and that lasts for about 3 seconds. I think this noise is the result of the microphone's position relative to the plane of the prop as it rotates through the location of the camera. And I think that is proof positive of an airplane in a spin. Surely you've been to an air show and you hear airplanes doing spins. You can hear that prop noise. Same kind of prop noise. A typical spin profile lasts about 5 seconds with a rotation rate of about 72 degrees per second. We would expect to hear prop noise from the airplane for roughly half of each rotation. The next thing we hear is a swishing noise from the airplane rotating through the air, which is a turbulent wake that we hear. 6.3 seconds after the first prop noise, we hear the prop noise again, but this time it stabilizes. And in all, it lasts for just under 5 seconds until impact. The last recorded descent rate of 1,984 feet per minute was consistent with the very beginning of a spin departure. That is about 33 feet per second. Extrapolating that point to the last prop noise we heard puts the aircraft at approximately 166 feet above the point of impact at the beginning of that segment. It's not much altitude. Looking at the security footage, we could just see the airplane during the last seconds of its descent, obscured partly by the trees. But it looks to me like the airplane had stopped rotating, which means the crew had likely stopped the spin, stopped the rotation, and now we're confronted with recovering from the dive. And it takes a while to do that. Without a clearer image, it looks like the airplane was in about a 70 to 80 degree dive just prior to impact. This is consistent with the wreckage distribution around the point of impact, all together, clustered very close together. The impact point was on the street, close to the curb. The fuel in the wings was dispersed during the crash sequence and then caught fire, burning the airplane, spreading over the street, and then ahead to a nearby van parked on the curb, but also across the street. What this data and the video tell me is that the airplane was in the beginning stages of recovery from the stall spin that had occurred at a higher altitude, and it did not have enough altitude to recover. This was not a fully developed spin. It was an initial stage, technically called the incipient stage of departure. The definition may seem academic to you, but the real importance for me is that the descent rate is usually higher in that stage right there than in a fully developed spin. Fully developed spin is more stable and has a little bit slower descent rate. It appears that the last maneuver was a climb at very slow speed. I'm not sure what that might represent on the commercial ACS, but the profile of that maneuver was the same as the one performed just a few minutes prior, slow flight kind of attitude, but the first one was done with a descent. The second one, the accident sequence, was at about a 500 foot per minute climb. Realize that the level stall speed for this Bonanza is about 55 knots indicated. Several times the recorded ground speed of the airplane plus the wind speed flirted with the stall speed, because we had to infer. This airplane was in a climb just prior to departure, and the stall would have occurred at a higher speed. It is also likely that the engine RPM was set at a reduced power setting, again, for what appears to be an intentional slow flight and climb. The crew was flirting with the stall throughout the latter stages of this flight. I feel like they were really close this whole time. And the elephant in the room here is the way the data is presented. In the flying game, we often refer to cruise altitudes or altitudes we do maneuvers at by reference to the altimeter. And since the airplane burned, I doubt the NTSB will be able to discern what the altimeter setting was, but the ADS-B data shows us that the stall occurred about 2,275 feet. Okay, and you have to dig a little to find out what the ground elevation of that area was, but it was about 676 feet, meaning that the stall occurred at 1,600 feet above the ground. That's just a little over pattern altitude. The 1,300-foot overcast was driving them down. I understand that. But what when I do full stalls and spins at severe unusual altitudes, I do it with more than 5,000 feet above the ground, typically 6,500, 7,000 feet. A typical one-turn spin recovery will take around 1,000 feet. If I screw it up, then I've got some cushion to fix my problem. I can consistently hit those numbers because I do spins a lot. And if you've never done one, if you haven't done one for years, can you do it in this situation that 29 Victor found itself in? A full-blown departure at 1,600 AGL? For this accident, there was no room for error. In fact, there was no room to recover from a departure in the first place at the altitude it occurred at. The departure occurred just a little higher than a normal pattern altitude, about 500 feet. And you can see that there's no chance of recovering from a spin at low altitude. Even at pattern altitude, it's worse. That extra 500 feet wasn't even enough to do it. I have to ask, why were they flying at such slow speed so close to the ground? I don't understand it. If the weather forced them down from the maneuvers they wanted to do, well, okay, why not wait until a better time instead of cram it in low altitude where you have no margin for error? The Beech Pilot POH sets an emergency approach speed of 83 knots for the straight-tail short-body Bonanzas, most of them. And since the C33 Debonair is pretty much the same as my airplane, I would expect that its emergency speed would be probably close to that. 81 knots is what it is for A36s. So, and I think that Dan Greider's onto something here regarding AQP, in other words, learning and practicing the maneuvers and the skills needed to avoid being a statistic in accidents that are actually happening in the real world as opposed to some notion of training. This loss of control in flight could have been avoided by not trying to cram a slow flight exercise in at low altitude with no margin for error. I'm foot stomping that. For me, a minimum speed at low altitude in the pattern, unless I'm on short final, is the emergency approach speed, 83 knots. From Dan's AQP, that minimum speed at low altitude would be his DMMS, or 1.4 times the stall speed. For this C33, that would be just over 72 knots. For me, that's too slow at low altitude and not be on short final. Okay, I'm not going to stooge around at that speed. But for this airplane, it would have meant a normal landing if they had been doing it. If you found yourself in a similar situation, the only way to survive this departure experienced by the crew of 29 Victor would be to immediately unload the airplane and use coordinated rudder and aileron to stop the spin from going any further than that initial nose slice. And then you have to recover from the dive, and you don't have a lot of altitude to do it. There isn't time to evaluate it. There isn't time to make a judgment call and execute it. You have to have trained for it and seen it to do it successfully. I suspect that the CFI in this accident very likely had to spend time to evaluate and then execute that recovery attempt. That was simply time he didn't have. You can't argue with physics. You're just going to lose every time. There just wasn't enough time or altitude to survive this accident with the way it happened. I do this stuff a lot, and I don't think I can recover from a spin at 1,600 feet AGL, not in a Bonanza. The spin prevent is my go-to. Actually, that's not true. I don't fly the airplane in a way that puts me in the square corners with no alternative. And I'm hoping that that is your approach as well. The spin prevent is a backup last chance maneuver, and I advocate getting some training in that so it is in your tool bag. To sum it up, I think the best course of action is to, one, get UPRT training to inoculate yourself from a severe upset that would lead to a loss of control in flight. or any other action that would lead to LOCI. Then 2, fly a speed that gives you enough energy to avoid the stall. And 3, leave low altitude maneuvering to the airshow pilots, people who are used to and operate in that regime and know the dangers. There's just not a lot of time. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Flywire.